In one of the earliest civilizations on Earth, a slave could own property, start his own business, and even take his master to court. And yet, he had no right to his own haircut. How do those two things fit in the same society? And more importantly, who came up with the idea of owning people in the first place? To answer that, we have to go way back, and we have to start with something that sounds almost unbelievable. For most of its history, as far as we can tell, humanity had no slaves at all. Hundreds of thousands of years, not a single one. And then we invented something, and slavery showed up almost instantly. The very same thing that lets you watch this video right now. Let's start with the obvious suspect, the caveman. Logic says if anyone kept slaves, it'd be these guys with clubs. Nope. Researcher Peter Gray of Boston College describes hunter-gatherers as actively egalitarian. They lived in groups of 20 to 50 people and literally made sure no one climbed too high. Anthropologists even have a term for it, reverse dominance. But it's not even about ideals, it's about logistics. For a nomad, owning a person is a terrible business idea. You have to feed him year-round, and you've got nothing to hold him with. No walls, no storehouses, no jail. The worst asset on earth. Yours today, over the next hill tomorrow. So the people we picture as the most primitive were actually some of the freest humans in history. Freer than almost everyone who came after them. Then, around 11,000 years ago, a catastrophe happened. One we usually call progress. Agriculture. People settled down, started growing grain, and, for the first time ever, building up surpluses. And that's where the chain reaction starts. Extra grain has to be stored somewhere, so you get storehouses. Whatever's in the storehouse has to be claimed and guarded, so you get private property. Economists Samuel Bowles and Jung Kyu Choi tie the birth of property directly to this moment. And to plant, harvest, and haul all that grain, you need cheap hands. And the cheapest hands are the ones that belong to you completely. That's how a slave grows out of a bag of grain. And that's the twist. Slavery didn't crawl up to us out of the wild. It walked in arm in arm with civilization. The walls we built to protect ourselves worked just as well in reverse. Now the slave had nowhere to run. Now, you might ask, so hunter-gatherers never had slavery at all? Almost. But there's one exception, and it proves the rule perfectly. On the Pacific Northwest coast of North America lived the Tlingit and the Haida. No agriculture at all, pure hunters and fishers. But the salmon ran in such huge numbers that they settled down, grew wealthy, and built up storehouses. And the result was the same, slavery. Somewhere between 10 and 35% of the population. So it wasn't really about the plow. It was about surplus plus settling down. The moment people had something to stockpile and somewhere to keep it, other people made it onto the list of things you could stockpile. The earliest written traces of slavery don't lead to Rome or Egypt. They lead to Sumer, to the city of Lagash, around 3,000 years before the Common Era. And you know what archaeologists find on those clay tablets? People. Listed in the same column as livestock and grain. Researcher Robert Englund points out that in the earliest texts, humans seem to have been counted pretty much the way cattle were counted in a herd ledger. The world's first writing system, and one of its very first uses, was keeping inventory of people as goods. So much for the dawn of civilization. There were two roads into slavery. The first was war. Lose a battle, become property. The second was scarier, because it reached your own people too. Debt. A free farmer borrows grain in a bad year, can't pay it back, and hands over first his children, then his wife, then himself. A whole family turned into property over one bad harvest. And as far as the tablets can tell us, a large share of the earliest slaves were women. The Sumerian word for a female slave, geme, literally means mountain woman, because they were brought down from foreign highlands. But here's an important detail. There weren't many slaves. Historian Seth Richardson of the University of Chicago estimates they were about 5% of the population. A typical household had one or two. This isn't plantations yet. This is still the small-scale domestic version of the nightmare. And that domestic version hides the strangest contradiction in the whole story. Remember that slave from the beginning? The one who could take his master to court but had no right to his own haircut? Time to explain how that's even possible. These early slaves had rights. Seriously, a slave in Mesopotamia could own property, run a business, testify in court, marry a free woman, and even save up silver and buy his own freedom. And back then, taverns were run by women too. The Code of Hammurabi has separate rules for female tavern keepers, so a slave could absolutely have run his own bar. Sounds almost bearable, until you hear the other side. Slaves were marked. They were given a special haircut, the abutu, a particular lock or knot of hair. Under the laws of Eshnunna, a slave wearing that mark simply wasn't allowed to walk out the main city gate, and a barber who secretly shaved that mark off would have his hand cut off under the Code of Hammurabi. Running away was treated as rebellion, and hiding a runaway slave was punishable by death. Harvard sociologist Orlando Patterson, in his famous book Slavery and Social Death, called this exact condition social death. A slave isn't just exploited, he's cut off from his family, his name, and his past. And tellingly, among the tools of that cutting off, Patterson specifically names hairstyle and marks on the body, that same abutu, a man who could have his own bar, but had no right to his own haircut. And here's what's both funny and grim. The first laws in history were written, in large part, to manage slaves and property. The Code of Ur-Nammu, from around 2,100 years before the Common Era, is the oldest surviving law code on Earth. A bit later, the laws of Eshnunna calmly put a price tag on a human being. If an ox gores a free man to death, the owner pays 40 shekels. If it gores a slave, just 15. A person valued at less than his own death. An ancient price list you really wouldn't want to find yourself on. And the Code of Hammurabi, from around 1,750 years before the Common Era, the one that gave us an eye for an eye, valued a slave at around 20 shekels of silver. But there was also a reset button. Every so often, kings would declare a general cancellation of debts and free the debt slaves, a kind of ancient jubilee. The Sumerians called it a margi, which literally translates as return to the mother. Their word for freedom literally meant go back home to mom. Economist Michael Hudson counted about 30 of these debt cancellations over more than 1,000 years of ancient history. Basically the world's first wipe the slate clean and start over button. 4,000 years before banks were invented. And finally, let's put a couple of myths to rest. Myth number 1, the big one. Slaves built the pyramids. Nope. Archaeologists Zahi Hawass and Mark Lehner dug up an entire town of pyramid builders next to Giza, with bakeries, dormitories, and medical care. Researcher Richard Redding calculated that the workers were fed almost 4,000 pounds of meat a day. They were buried with honor, right in the shadow of the pyramids. As Hawass put it, you don't bury slaves like that. These were paid workers, working in rotating shifts with one day off in every 10. Myth number 2. The word slave comes from Slav. That part's true, but heads up, it happened in the Middle Ages, roughly 4,000 years after Sumer. It has nothing to do with our ancient humans at all. And no, it wasn't aliens. Shout out to the fans of the Anunnaki theory, the one where humanity was genetically engineered as a slave race to mine gold. Great story, completely made up. So yes, ancient humans had slaves, but it wasn't monsters who created them, or gods, or aliens. We did, the moment we had our first surplus bag of grain. We didn't invent slavery because we were evil. We invented it because we'd finally piled up enough stuff to make it worth it. It wasn't savagery, it was the bill civilization handed us, and we're still paying it.